Farewell to Eden by Theodore Sturgeon. Originally published in an anthology called Invasion from Mars, Interplanetary Stories, selected and edited by Orson Welles in June 1949. Republished in two anthologies edited by August Derleth. The first called The Outer Reaches, Favorite Science Fiction Tales chosen by their authors in 1958, then The Time of Infinity in 1963. Its first and last known inclusion in a collection of the author's stories was in The Perfect Host, The Complete Stories of Theodore Sturgeon, Volume 5 in 1998. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Farewell to Eden. There was nothing in his mind but a warm blackness, or perhaps a very dark redness. There was a field of it in which he was lying, a sheet of it over him. The field reached from his back into infinity, and the sheet was as thick as the universe. The darkness was in his eyes and in his lungs, in his bones. He was part of the darkness, inside and out, through and through. He could never know how long it was that he stared at the spot of light before he realized that it was there. There was no way of telling how large it was, or how small, how near or how distant. It was vague. It had no discernible limits, no edges. It grew until it was an oval patch of clear yellow light in the surrounding darkness. And at last it was more than a patch of light. It was a hole in the darkness through which he could see. He saw a mechanical elbow, a housing from the ends of which two metal arms extended down and into the impenetrable darkness beside him. The arms were moving rhythmically. Something was fraying the edges of the oval hole. A translucent border ate away at the darkness, continuously feeding the patch of clear light, slowly pushing back the darkness. And then he began to feel a surge of sensation, a tickling, prickling wash of feeling. It had the rhythm of the moving metal arms. It was pins and needles, my foot's asleep, the seed of unconsciousness in the lungs of a man being gassed. It was comfort and agony. As it grew and as it faded, he wanted to laugh, but when it was at its peak, he wanted to scream. When at last he could see everything around him, he did not know when it was that the widening hole had become the real world, spreading to his horizons and beyond, having eaten and eaten at the dark until the last round speck of black had ceased to exist somewhere behind him, far, far out in infinity. The housing above him, with its pair of moving arms, was only one of many, one of 8. The 16 arms reached down to his body. At their ends were padded packages of something which pulsed and tingled, and the arms were making these packages massage his skin, back and forth, down and back, over and over, with the same firm pressure, the constant rhythm. This rhythm paralleled the washes of prickling agony, of tickling pleasure. He was lying on his back, naked. His body was free. Either he could not move it, or he did not think of trying. His head was clamped. He felt a padded band on each side. Suddenly this seemed an affront, an insult. He moved his head and was rewarded by a stab of anguish which came not from within him, a protest of disused muscles, but from outside, from the head clamp. He did not try to fight it. Lying quite still, he felt 4 thick needles being withdrawn from the back of his neck, easing a pressure he had not known was there. When they were gone, he began to suffocate. The light dimmed. The spot of red blackness reappeared and grew, spreading fast, much faster than it had left him. Now it was his horizon. Now its edges were an oval before him. Now they had enclosed the housing above his head. With the growth of the darkness, a pressure that became a pain grew into a tearing agony, unbearable. All the pain and all the fear that had ever been since the beginning of time sat on his chest. To move it, to get away from it, to stop that deadly agony, he breathed. When he drew in the first breath, the darkness stopped growing. When he breathed again, the oval of light widened and the pain lessened. With yet another breath, the oval widened again and stopped, and the pain became even less. With each breath, he drove back the darkness. So he breathed more deeply, a little faster. It became easier to do as the darkness and the pain fled away from him, to his horizons, back and around behind him somewhere, dwindled to a patch, a spot, a speck, and ceased to exist. He laughed then and moved his head confidently against the clamps. They broke and fell away. The inside of his mouth, his tongue and his teeth were ice cold. The rest of his body was warm, too warm on the outside, around a core of cold. Having laughed and moved his head, he fell asleep, still on his back, but with his head turned sidewise and a smile on his lips. The arms, with their pulsing, tingling pads, kept working while he slept. The veil of sleep had thinned about him and was easily torn by the breath of laughter which awoke him. He opened his eyes and lay looking, seeing nothing but the laughter. It was gone, but he could see it, a rushing of golden steps, veined gold, the veins full of wind whispers, for it was not a completely voiced laugh, but partly an alive, joyful expulsion of unwanted pressure. At first, he thought it was the memory of his own laugh, but on looking, as it were, at the fingerprints of the laugh, on the particular sensory impression the sound had made, he found them not in his throat, as if he himself had made it, but in his ears. He sat up. Blood roared in his head. Blackness closed, filmed, and cleared away. He raised his head and saw that the metal arms were folded up out of the way now, motionless. He was on a complicated bed over which was a great transparent hood. This had separated at his right, and a second had slid downward, a section the full length of the bed. It was an invitation, and though he was conscious of no desire to move, he reacted to the fact of the open door. He swung his legs out and sat on the edge and began to tremble with weakness. He looked around. There were 3 lights, 2 of which he could see, the third one under a deep shade. One was over his head, one on the wall, the shaded one between him and the wall, flooding another bed like his with light. On it, the 8 pairs of metal arms were moving rhythmically, the pads at their ends pressing and caressing a woman. It seemed that the pressure of them went down into the body, coating itself like a paint on the bones, layer on layer, and he knew somehow that these layers were life, and that when they were thick enough to include the skin, the whole woman would be alive. It must be, he thought, in a way which was not thought at all, that a part of her must have been alive before the pads started moving, so that they would have something on which to lay their paint. She must have been, the alive part, only a wire woman, a line drawing of living threads, one for each arm, one for each leg, one for the torso, and a knot for the head. She was naked. Her body was young and firm. It interested him only as part of the moving unit, with its padded arms stroking and pressing. He slid off his bed to the floor, cushioning his fall with knees and hands. His elbows refused to hold him up, and his chin went almost to the floor. He stayed there for a moment, in an equilibrium like that of his first breath, when he had stopped the darkness but had not yet driven it back. Then, as he had done before, he threw off the discomfort and straightened his elbows, his back straining to help. He dragged himself across the floor and squatted back on his haunches to watch. To watch, he had to hold his head up higher than normal. It hurt to do this, and he began to tremble again, but for a long, tense period, 3 minutes, 4 perhaps, he watched. The pads moved on her feet, pressing and stroking. At every third stroke, one would sweep around and run up the sole of her foot from heel to toe. Another pair tended her calves, one inside, one outside. The flesh beneath them swelled and hollowed into complete quiescence, while the inside pad made its special trip, one in every fifth movement, over her kneecap. There was a pair of pads for each thigh, running from the knee to the hollow of her groin, and a pair which danced around each other to alternate with them on the groin, then to follow upward to the lower ribs and back. Another pair swept between her breasts and downward, around to the back and up to the ribs, where the others had finished. Every 12th stroke pressed downward from her collarbones to her solar plexus, ignoring the route around to her back. He watched in wonder. After a short while, his head sagged. He turned it and fell asleep again, squatting his cheekbone on his knee and the top of his head against the side of the woman's bed. It was another sound that awoke him the next time. Again he opened his eyes and looked for it, found it, and examined it, though it was gone. Again he failed to find the imprint of it in him anywhere, and he understood, too, that it was not from the woman. The laugh, the second one, had been hers. He knew that. This new sound came from neither of them. He raised his head and, doing so, swayed forward. He put out an arm to keep from falling, and the act further awakened him. The woman was lying beside him, sprawled brokenly on the floor. She looked at him and away, looked around her and back to him again. She lay as if she had done what he had done, as if she had left her bed and slid to the floor. But she had not crawled. She lay there beside him, taking in the room, his bed, herself, and him. Gowrie. That was the sound, coming again. It did a strange thing to him. He looked for the source of the sound. He could not find it, but inside he recognized something. Those syllables meant something of surpassing importance, but he could not determine what it was. Gowrie! He looked for the source of sound and could not find it. He saw that the woman was looking at him. Gowrie! He looked again and saw it. It was a cone, its wide mouth pointing at him, its throat a smooth, bland disk of metal. He turned to the woman, and she was looking at him. There was a silence. He thought, when it says Gowrie, I look for the sound, and she looks at me. Gowrie. He looked at the cone quickly, and then at the girl. The thing had spoken, and he had looked at it, but she had looked at him. He said, Gowrie. His mind reached out. Comprehension close. Gowrie, the woman faltered. He nodded. He understood now. He was Gowrie. Gowrie? His breath hissed out in response. He drew in more and tried again. Yes, he said. Yes. Then, yes, Sylph, Tilsa, said the woman. They were quiet for a moment, looking at each other. The cone said, Tilsa. She looked at the cone, and he looked at her. He understood immediately that she was Tilsa. She was Tilsa, he was Gowrie. He put out his hand, and she looked at it. He was not yet strong enough to hold it up. It fell to the floor beside her, and she stared at it. Then, swiftly, unexpectedly, sleep overcame her. For a long while he squatted there, looking at her. Then he slept too. He awoke with an awareness of something within himself. He lay with his eyes closed, relaxed and receptive. He knew somehow that he was strong now, that if he moved he would not tremble, knew it so well that he did not have to try to move. There was a skin full of knowledge within him. A thin skin stretched tight by the knowledge it held. The knowledge swirled and swelled, stretching the skin tighter and more transparent every second. He saw things inside the skin. A bearded face, a clutter of rusty, crumbled ruin, a flight of dart-shaped aircraft with a sound to them like a blowtorch in a barrel, the sun shining on rolling green lawns, and repeatedly black, star-spangled space in which a cloudy planet floated. The tones of a voice were there, too, circling and weaving amid the swirling knowledge. The voice meant something to him. Suddenly he knew what it was. It was the voice which had said, "Gowrie," and "Tilsa." The voice from the cone. It was not his voice. It belonged to a thing, a person, someone who knew him, knew Tilsa, too. Everything about them. "Gowrie." He opened his eyes. Tilsa was awake, still lying on the floor, looking at him and smiling. He was on his bed. He must have dragged himself back to it in the beginnings of sleep. Suddenly, harshly, he said, "Be quiet." He hardly realized he had used the words. Her call had punctured the skin of knowledge within him. It burst and flooded his mind, a bewildering deluge. He shut Tilsa out with his voice and his eyelids, to be alone with the knowledge again. The bearded face was Alan. Alan was Tilsa's father. He was dead. The ruined cities were dead. The flights of dart-like aircraft had killed them. The rolling green lawns were outside his room. Was it a room? Wasn't it more a machine, some kind of equipment? The room or machine was by itself away from all the world, carved out of a forest on the floor of a deep ravine in Mesa country. The ravine was deep, wider at the bottom than at the top, most secret. He remembered sunlight on the lawns because they used to snatch at it, he and Tilsa, as it whisked by day after day for their hurried half-hour of basking as the stripe of sunlight swept finger-like over their hidden buildings. The world was mad. The world was an insane worm, toothed and hating itself. It broke itself in two, in four, in 8, and each part was toothed and hating itself and all the other parts. Each part fought, biting and tearing at itself, and the parts of itself in a fury of immolation. The worm was man, a species destroying itself, a race destroying itself, a culture, a nation, a city, a single human being snapping and snarling at his internal selves. "But you'll be saved," Alan had said. "The radioactive dust will soon be filtering down to us, even out here. You can imagine what it must be in the cities. Most of them will die. Most of those who don't will be sterile, and probably the few who can breed won't breed true. But you will, you and Tilsa. You'll do it there." There was the cloudy planet, afloat in space. Its clouds were not like the ones here. Its atmosphere held different elements, poisonous to the animals of Earth. They would have been to Gowrie and Tilsa too then, before their long sleep, the longest sleep any humans had ever slept, before the tireless, meticulous workings of their bed machines. Their bodies had stopped completely through and through, and then the cells had been altered, each a little, to rest a while, and then to be altered a little more. Now they were, and were not, Gowrie and Tilsa, even as any human in 7 years has completely replaced every cell of his body and is not, the same. But the replacement in Gowrie and Tilsa was an adjustment to another environment, even to a slightly different gravity. They were aliens on Earth now, as a ship is an alien, a manufactured alien when it lies completed as yet dry in the launching ways. Gowrie sat up, swung his legs to the floor, and stood up, stretching. He felt the good muscles of his back and thighs. He flexed and watched his fingers. "I remember," he said simply. Tilsa shaped her mouth around words. "I remember, too. Alan, and the ship. Tilsa, the ship. Yes, it's up there." She pointed at the ceiling. He laughed. "He did it. Alan did it." Tilsa rose, feeling air, the new kind of air, in her lungs, feeling the new way her body obeyed. "Wasn't there something we had to do first?" "I don't remember," he said. "Where's the ship?" He cast about him. There was a door with a great stainless steel bar across it. He lifted against the bar, and immediately the flat-throated cone spoke. "Have you read the book?" "That was it! The thing I couldn't remember!" Tilsa cried. The book was on a shelf under the wall light. They pounced on it. Its opening words were in very simple language, as if written for the benefit of young children. "You, man, are Gowrie. You, woman, are Tilsa. Read this book. Do not go out of this room until you have read this book." There were tests to be made on themselves and on the air. There were solutions to be mixed from the racks of stores they found. There was much to be learned, but they learned it with increasing ease. They had learned it all once before, prior to their long sleep. It was an engrossing study, and they slept twice before they finished it. And then they opened the door. Outside was a corridor to another closed door. On the wall hung 2 heavy suits with transparent spherical helmets. Eagerly they climbed into them, inspected each other's fastenings. Then they closed the door behind them and opened the one ahead. The Earth's air swirled in. They could see the water vapor in it with their new eyes. The air seemed turgid, misty. It frightened them a little, for they knew it was choking poison to them now. They crossed a narrow gully to a place where 2 low mounds, rounded and covered with brush, stood against a rock wall. They looked at the mounds, appalled. "They were pylons," Gowrie breathed. "Tall, square pylons." "How many years?" asked Tilsa, expecting no answer. Shrugging off his sudden sadness, Gowrie took a tool from his belt and pressed a stud on the side of it. Blue flame licked out and washed over the cliff between what was left of the pylons. The deposits of years crumbled away under the lash of flame, and suddenly a great square section cracked and toppled toward them. They jumped back as it crashed and broke. Gowrie put away the tool. Before them was still another door. Gowrie pressed it with his gloved hands, kicked it once with a heavy boot, and it swung open, admitting them to a shaft. They switched on the lights built into their suits, their beams shooting forward and upward. A stainless steel ladder took them up perhaps 50 feet to a room built off the side of the shaft. At this point the shaft was roofed by the banked tubes of the ship, and the room gave access to the ship's side. The ship seemed to fit in the shaft like a piston in its cylinder. They entered the open port and, by means of the controls inside, swung it shut. There was the distant hum of machinery as the air in the lock was replaced with the atmosphere they had been readied for. Gowry's gloved hand touched Tilsa's, and, suddenly overawed, he grasped it. It was such a long way they had come, and yet the journey was only beginning. A green light flashed on, and the inner door swung open. They stepped into the ship. "It's all right," said Gowry, nodding toward the green light, and began to remove his suit. They hung the suits carefully on the clips which had been built for them. For a moment they clung together, trembling. Then they mounted to the control room in the ship's nose and found another book, a thick one. "Remember?" "Yes," she nodded. "Fuel, food, water, air, jet tests, star sights, course computations. We're going to be busy." Gowry looked around the compact control room with learning, relearning eyes. "Let's get to it," he said. 2 days later, they had learned their ship and themselves, and had tested themselves and their ship. With every small step of progress, they felt an increasing awe of Alan and of the thing he had built. They remembered his words. "Mankind is accursed everywhere. It must start anew, in a place which it has not burned over and ruined." His words awed them, but even more the nature of his work awed them, for he did it knowing that he would never see the result, for a purpose transcending the two lives he was saving and recreating. He had done it as an act of faith in a creature which had violated every faith ever put in it. A rockfall had damaged the great winch designed to raise the ship up through its tunnel until it could break through the surface of the mesa above them. They worked shoulder to shoulder to repair it, and at last had their craft with its nose to the outer air. They took their star sights and found that in just 4 days they could blast off, hurl themselves free of the Earth's gravity, and run out to intersect the orbit of their new world. They used the time to examine a tired planet and its graves, and the horrors that were worse than graves, mankind's living dead. With a tight beam scanner, they ranged the surface, throwing on a screen pictures of places near them and of places far away. "It's a sunny place," Tilsa observed, watching the screen. It seemed they had seen so little of the sun. They had been very young when they first came to the mesa. "Look!" tore from Gowry's throat. They saw a cliff, cave openings. Creatures squatted around a fire at the foot of the cliff. They were short and broad, their torsos as long and thick as Gowry's, but their legs seeming to have no thighs. Short, stiff, thick, ending in enormous, flat, toeless feet. Some of them moved about slowly, their feet in a grotesque, shuffling dance. One or two, approaching faster from a distance, vaulted along on their knuckles, making crutches of their arms. Burning and sputtering on the coals of the fire was one of their own. They tore off handfuls of the hot, half-raw meat, gnawing at it with yellow fangs. Gowry's throat was thick with nausea. "Humanity's children," he whispered, and spun the control to blank the screen. "What the world must have gone through while we slept," he mused, "to have such things fit to survive here." "Look some more," said Tilsa. Her face was rapt, half hypnotized with revulsion. "We should know. We should find out everything we can." Reluctantly, Gowry turned to the controls again, scanning the earth. He stopped briefly here and there. A ruined, grave, quiet city. A road, beautiful in its narrowing course, but with its surface crumbled and overgrown. Quiet valleys, untouched and lovely. Deserts where crawling giant weeds had choked out all life, including their own. Then came the picture they were never to forget. Tilsa! A different kind! They saw a house, seemingly of metal, in rolling country near wooded mountains. It was hexagonal, quite low, with a shining, peaked roof. There were creatures near it, 2 of them. They were tall, slender, blue-hued, with long heads and curved, muscular tails. They ran out into the sun in great, graceful leaps. They stopped, hand in hand, brought their free hands to touch too, and their tails curved up over their heads until they touched each other. They stood there in this curious contact for a long moment. "Why, how beautiful!" cried Tilsa. Then, from the foot of the meadow in which they stood, like a spilling over of some foul container, came a mass of the short-legged humanoids. The crutch-like sweep of their long arms advanced them with terrifying speed as they crowded up the slope. "Look out! Run!" Gowrie shouted at the screen, uselessly. The blue creatures stood, oblivious of their danger, until the leaders of the horde were on them. They did not appear to resist. There was a swirl of motion, a piling up of the ravening humanoids, and it was over. One by one, they crept away from the snarling mob, bearing grisly blue fragments which they tore to bits with their teeth and spat out. "No more," Tilsa said, faintly. "No more." Gowrie turned off the set and sank down beside her. "What for?" he said, as if to himself. "What did they do it for?" "They saw a difference," she said, her eyes agonized. "Mankind has always pulled down and destroyed anything that is different. Even if the differences are slight, they will be sought out. Alan used to say that if there was just one human left on Earth, he would kill himself because of the differences he would find in his own thought. It won't be that way with us," he said quietly. "No, it can't be. It can't." Their time came. The automatic machinery clicked and hummed and purred about its many tasks. Gowrie fed a punched card into the course integrator and switched it on. The ship would blast off at the precise instant for which it was set. They strapped themselves into the acceleration chairs, side by side. Moving his hand spider-wise against the restraining fabric, Gowrie edged it over until it touched Tilsa's. To his surprise, she pulled away. "Don't," she said. "You make me think of those blue ones." The jets thundered and they hurtled away. The great shaft fell in on itself under the battering thrust of the flames. They both blacked out. When Gowrie came to, he was aware first of his laboring heart and the great pressure which lay upon him. At 7 gravities, his limbs weighed hundreds of pounds. His eyeballs ached, and his heart all but groaned its protest. He forced his eyelids open and looked ahead, and his heart began to beat more strongly, exultantly. Before him was the majesty of interstellar space, a bejeweled purple curtain. 8.5 hours later, the acceleration cut down to a more controllable 2 1/3 gravities. Breathing was easier, and they could talk. But they said little, instead lying in the chairs, drinking in the wonder before them. The days fled, marked only by the clock, by hunger and sleep. Once Tilsa spoke of the blue beings. "I wish I had never seen them. I wish I didn't know about the part of humanity that kills for nothing. Think of this ship," he told her, "of that part of humanity that made Alan do this work." "Waste," she murmured. "That's the sin of it. The waste. Oh, the songs men have sung, the fine and beautiful things written and painted and built, all come to ruination." She wept. "Oh, the waste. Humanity's trademark, he said bitterly, stamped sooner or later on all of man's works. She stroked the edge of the instrument panel. Not all, she pleaded. Not all. They made their planetfall with Gowrie at the manual controls. Round and round the cloudy globe they went, the braking rockets roaring, until at last the outer skin of the ship trembled to a high screaming atmosphere. They plunged through it and out again, letting it check their speed, but not taking enough to burn them, meteor-like. He threw out blast after blast from the forward jets, and they entered the atmosphere again, lost it, took it, held it, and began to spiral in. He kicked in the 6 gyro-controlled supporting jets, which blasted down and outward. They settled until they were in the white sea of cloud around the planet. Blinded by it, they turned on the scanner and coupled the supporting jets to the radar altimeter. They passed a mountain range and another and a long series of foothills and a great sea. And at last, in the radar scope, they saw a coast. Gowrie slid the ship in toward it. He touched the water. The ship porpoised with a grinding wrench, settled and skipped again, rode the surface until it slowed enough to displace some of its weight. Huge sheets of spray whipped out, and the ship floated. Gowrie kicked it forward with the jets, driving it confidently up onto the beach, where it stopped and rolled a little to the right to lie still like some great sea animal. "Beautifully done, darling." "Thanks," he said proudly. "It wasn't anything you could work up to. Had to be done right the first time. Are you running the atmosphere tests?" "All done, while you were piloting in." She held up a vial of purple fluid. "It reacts perfectly, and Allen's gravity, magnetic density, and radioactive indices all check. Let's go out," she caroled. "The suits. Damn the suits, darling. We're home." Laughing, they ran to the airlock, waited impatiently for the outside door to open. As it rolled back, Gowrie caught her wrist. "No, you don't," he said, checking her as she was about to leap. "We go into our house like this." And he swept her into his arms and stepped through the port, dropping easily to the ground beneath. "Put me down," she commanded. "I want to run." He let her go, and she was off like a deer into the mist. Shouting delightedly, he sprinted after her. He caught her on a knoll, a little hummocky island of ground in the surrounding mist. He pressed her to him, captured her laughing mouth with his lips. There was something near them in the fog. He raised his head, holding her tight, and saw it settle down through the air a little way off. Something big, angular, metallic. A house. A hexagonal house. He wondered, mutely. Like the Blue People's house, but this is a ship. And their house was a ship. Then, and they... Out of the hexagonal ship tumbled scores of them, blue people, but blue people dwarfed and transformed, with knotty little tails and shambling limbs, without the leaping grace, their beauty warped and gone. It was over in seconds. One by one, the blue mutants crawled away, spitting out the torn, bloody fragments. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.